of the Old Testament prophets. We had an introduction to the entire prophetic movement a few weeks back, and then in 3 parts we covered the book of Amos, one of the earliest of the 8th century prophets, who was a prophet to the northern Israel from the southern kingdom. Today we are moving to the book of Hosea. That we have already done that. We have already done an introduction to the book of Hosea. Hosea, who was from northern kingdom and who ministered in the northern kingdom of Israel. In the last class, we saw an overall introduction to the book of Hosea, and then we also saw the first 3 chapters. And as I said last week, the first 3 chapters is a overture or a meta-narrative, an overarching narrative of the entire book. Basically, the book is about Yahweh's relationship with his chosen people, Israel, southern kingdom of Judah and northern Israel included, that is the 12 tribes who were delivered from Egypt, made a covenant with God in Sinai, and who came and possessed the land. So because that covenant here in this book is understood as a marriage covenant, that is, God and his people are related or are covenanted as in a marriage, as husband and wife. That's only a metaphor. Now, what happens here is that relationship is fractured because of the unfaithfulness of the wife. Here, it means figuratively, it means the people of God, Israel. They have gone after other lovers, understood as the pagan deities, gods, and the pagan practices by rejecting their husband, who is the Lord. Now, that is the meta-narrative, but that is brought out through the real, or maybe a parabolic, but it is highly possible it is a real life of Hosea is used. That is, Hosea marries a woman of whoredom, and she runs after other lovers, and Hosea brings her back, longs her to come back, and finally he has to redeem her, purchase her from her bond slavery. And that's a metaphor for God's dealings with Israel. So that story, which is an overarching story of the entire book, is told in the first 3 chapters. And as I already mentioned in the introduction to the book of Hosea falls into 2 parts, 2 unequal parts, or 2 parts of unequal size. That is 1 to 3, which is an introduction, and then 4 to 14, chapters 4 to 14. So the 4 to 14, chapters 4 to 14 contains separate oracles. There is no thematic unity, and they are not really logically related to the first 3 chapters. But we have seen last week that all these small oracles that comes in chapter 4 to 14, chapters 4 to 14, are subsumed under this larger story or the meta-narrative of Hosea's marriage, which is symbolic of God's relationship with his people. So that is our concern now. Chapter 4, verse 1, 14 to 19. As I have already mentioned many times, chapter 4, 1, these are short oracles. Oracles of judgment, oracles of condemnation, accusation, not really judgment. I have already mentioned that, I think earlier, that the book of Hosea is more hopeful than the book of Amos. Here there is hope for the people of God to come back to Yahweh, who is always waiting for them to come back. So chapter 4 to 14 is mostly condemnation, accusing the people, accusing their rulers, and even accusing their priests for their misbehavior or as leading people astray from God. But except the last 5 verses, there is a prophecy of salvation towards the end of this book. In chapter 14, verses 4 to 8, there is a prophecy of salvation. So that is the overall structure of the second part of the book of Hosea. Basically, they are all short oracles of condemnation against God, the people of God, who have, like a prostitute, like a whore, has left her husband. The people have abandoned their God and gone after other lovers, Asherahs and Baals and whatnot, the pagan deities. Now, we will look at these prophetic oracles one by one. The first oracle that we would like to look at is chapter 4, verses 1 to 19. This is an oracle which says that God has initiated legal proceedings against the wife or the people of Israel who have gone astray from him. So, chapter 4, verse 1 reads, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness of steadfast love." So please note that word, the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. It is rather, the word controversy is rather a weak translation. In the Hebrew, it would mean a legal suit, a legal case that God is now presenting against the people or initiating legal proceedings. He says, I have a charge against you. I have these accusations against you in the form of a court case, a case presented in the court. So what happens is that then the crime or the offenses have to be listed. What is your controversy? What is your legal suit? What is your contention? So now in the remaining verses, the Lord, the Yahweh, presents his case or his charge against the people of Israel. It starts with lack of personal integrity. What is the main charge? The charge against the people is, or charges are, personal integrity. Look at verses 1 to 2 of chapter 4. And chapter 2 says there is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds and bloodshed follows bloodshed. So there are two main things you can say. The lack of personal integrity, which is very much part of Israel's commitment to God. They are not supposed to swear. They are not supposed to lie. They are not supposed to steal. It's all there in the 10 commandments and the elaboration of the 10 commandments in the book of law. They are not supposed to covet, but on the top of it, there is violence, bloodshed after bloodshed. Now there are many cases. Here Hosea is not detailing who committed this sin against whom. But if you read the former prophets, the book of Kings, for example, you can see that covetousness of Ahab led to the death of Naboth. The lust of King David led to bloodshed of Uriah, and many others were died because of the evil plot to get rid of Uriah. So violence follows lying, stealing, lust, covetousness, and all that. So that is what Yahweh contends with the people of Israel. There is no truthfulness. They have broken my covenant. To add to that, the second charge is found in chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. Now, while this is happening, the religious leader, the apathy of the religious leaders, they don't care. They don't worry about it. They don't correct people. They don't direct the people in the right path. Verse 4, yet no one contend, and let none accuse. For with you is my contention, O priest. He is addressing the priest. You shall stumble by day, the prophet also shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your Lord, I will forget your children. Now, what is the priestly duty? Many people think that priest's duty is to offer sacrifice. No, that is not the main duty. The main duty of duty of priest to us to teach the people the law, to let the will of God know. That was the main thing. And then they sing the praises of God in the altar. So singing and also giving the law, teaching the law means guiding them. That is the priestly duty. And the prophet has to also guide the people, proclaiming the will of God. But in the legal proceedings, the charge number 2 is that these religious leaders whom God has appointed, or who believe or claim that God has appointed them, they have forgotten or ignored their purpose, their religious duties of being God's men and women and leading the people. Now, I don't have to draw contemporary parallels, how that applies to our generation. This is what is going on now. Instead of telling truths that are unpleasant, but truths that are essential to please God and the true worship of God, we know what popular preachers do. They know evidently the people are wrong, but they don't correct people. Like the period of priest Eli, who did not really worry about, or he overlooked his duty of correcting his own children. He might have tried it for a while, but he gave up. So that's a serious charge that Yahweh has against his people. And the third charge is idolatry and pagan practices. Though there was the temple worship, then everything was going on fine. People are after idols, either secretly maybe. And they had pagan practices among them. And chapter 12, verses 12 to 14 of chapter 4, if you have your Bibles open before you, please do turn to that portions. My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. See, we may not know the details of these practices. Probably they had a stick to walk with them, and they thought that that stick will guide them automatically by some power, some occult power or something like that. So they go to idols made of wood and seek the God's will and God's guidance, direction from them. And so and they sacrifice on the tops of the mountains. So they have chosen hills, which comes in the next oracle. This is detailed there. Now they go to mountains and they have little shrines over there, and they burn offerings on the hills. And then like we do in India, in Indian culture, these are many of these things are very familiar. Like unlike Western minds, we can easily understand that because these are all still going on in our culture. Burning under the offerings that people leave at the foot of the trees, and under the oak or under the banyan trees or whatever sacred trees we find. We do that because our people, because they have ignored the true God. And then to add to this, here is another sin is picked out, and that is, or it stands out, that is chapter 14 verse 4, chapter 4 verse 14. See, this is called the sacred prostitution or shrine prostitution. 4:14 says, I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery. That is of very serious things. So what God says is that even worse things are happening. Even the brides or your daughters, or the virgin daughters are stray and go and commit adultery. I'm not going to punish them. He's not saying these are not punishable. But he is saying that even worse things are happening in your land. For the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. And people without understanding shall come to ruin. This is a practice which is also in the early days until we prohibited it by law in the later part of the 19th century. The temples were places where people were there, priests and priestesses, with whom people can go and do have prostitution, because they represented gods and goddesses, and that act, offering, it is called an offering. But this was practiced in Israel, such an abominable practice, an impact on the land. Now many times we think that the environmental crisis that we face, like floods, droughts, earthquakes, tsunamis, and when all these things happen, scientists and environmental experts say this is because of global warming, because we did not take care of our nature and things like that. But Bible has a different take on all this. See, in verse 4:3, it says, therefore, because of the sins of the people, the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. There is damage to the natural resources, the damage to life on earth. There is deprivation. Why? Because the sins of the people. So when the environmental scientists will explain all these crises that is happening in our world as a result of various other things, Bible has one word for all this, that is sin. The sin of the fallen human nature. And it is counterbalanced by the vision of a new creation, the redemption of the nature that God has in plan. After the redemption of our bodies, the nature is crying, the groaning, and God will redeem the new nature, the nature to a new state of a new heaven and new earth. Now, Hosea summarizes this section, saying that, look, all these sins have gone out of your hand. You have been sinning, constantly rebelling against God. Now, this is out of control. You will be swayed by this sin. Like when there is a strong wind, sometimes, when you carry an umbrella in the monsoon rain, you are holding it for a protection, but the storm may take the umbrella off your hand and you stand there in the rain. Similarly, Hosea says in chapter 4, he concludes this section with this imagery of a wind which blows and takes all the objects out of the way. The sins will swipe you out. Verse 18, when their drink is gone, they give themselves to whoring. I keep on saying that word that way. Their rulers dearly love shame. Verse 19, a wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. A wind, the imagery of a wind, will take them in its wings, will sweep in such a way that they will be be flown away, blown like a blower blows them, because sin has reached such a zenith. Now, the next prophet, with this powerful conclusion of the impact of their sin, lack of personal integrity, the sin or apathy of the leaders, the pagan practices, and unaware of the impact of their sin on the natural resources, God says, now this is going to wipe you out, blow you out like a strong wind. And the next chapter, chapter 5, verses 1 to 14, specifically talks about their idolatry in the high places. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 14. The high places are places or at the top of the hills and other things, wherever it is raised, places where they installed shrines to various gods, because in ancient religion, even in our culture also, we thought that the hills or the mountains, high mountains, are closer to heaven or closer to the abode of gods. So worship in high places was a pagan practice, because for God of Israel there is no high place, there is no low place, because God is present with them. God who moves with them, makes his presence with them. Now, describing, there are various, chapter 5 verses 8 to 12 mentions a number of places, but it is not an exhaustive list. A number of places where there were high places, or most popular high places, sacred places or pilgrim places where they went. Then God pronounces the judgment. In chapter 5 verse 14, for I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. Here is the picture of a lion that will attack its victim, a predator, and will tear apart the animal which he has caught, tear it into pieces, and walk away with some pieces to its den. Now look, Amos also talks about a lion that will that roars and scares the people who hear the roaring. But Hosea extends that metaphor a little bit further, and he says, here is a angry lion who will come attack the animal, its prey, and tear it apart and walk away with it. This is the punishment for abandoning God. Now, we move on to a third oracle here, which is chapter 5, 15 to 6:13, 6:3. In the introduction, I said many things. Two things particularly I would like to remind you again. One is the poetic beauty of the book of Hosea. We just saw one, that is the lion, the judgment presented to us in using the imagery of an angry lion who will tear into pieces the prey that he caught. But another thing that I told you that in the book of Hosea is that there is hope, always hope. God actually tries to, is like a puffing dragon, and then suddenly the tone changes to hope and love. Now, same thing happens here too. Now, after describing the lion that not only roars but tears his prey into pieces, in chapter 5:15 to 6:3, there is an appeal to return. The speaker in chapter 5:15 is God himself. He says, I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. This phrase, I will return again to my place, it simply means that I will withdraw my favor over my people. I will withdraw the favor upon my people. How long will God withdraw the favor? Until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. Now, the guilt is detailed in the previous oracle, and the punishment is also uttered, that utter destruction will be the punishment. But he says, I will keep my favor withdrawn from them. But until they acknowledge their guilt, they come to understand that they are guilty, they seek God's favor and they seek God's face and come back to him. This is what God says. And in the next 3 verses, the speaker changes. The speaker is Hosea. Having heard the judgment or the punishment that God will become a roaring lion that tears its prey, and then God's own word that God will be favorable to them when they return to him and seek his face. Hosea exhorts his people in chapter 6, 1 to 3. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us. See, tie this with the previous verse, 5:14. Come, God says, I am going to tear you apart, tear you into pieces. And he says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us, for he has struck us down, and he will bind us up. Now, here is the punishment of God. He has torn us. But let's come, that he may heal us. The one who tore us into pieces is the one who will heal us. There is no other. So let's go back to him. Let's not go to any other person. That's what we do. When some injury happens to us, we don't go to the same person for healing. We go to somebody else. But here Hosea says, let's go back to the one who tore us, and so that he will heal. The one who struck us down, he will bind us again. And then he says in verse 2, after 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. This is also a very, very powerful imagery. So let's go back to him now, the doctor, the physician. And within 2 days we will be all right. We'll come back to life. He'll put all the pieces together and give us life. And on the third day, we'll be able to stand on our own feet. That's the imagery. That's all that Hosea knew. There is hope in God because God has offered us hope. Though that is what the meaning that Hosea, or that is what Hosea intended. In the light of the Bible, this is being used to refer to the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ on the third day. It's not, so don't look at that original context here. It is not a punishment for Jesus. His death is not a punishment for Jesus. He was not torn apart. But that verse is taken to assure us in Luke 24:46 and 1 Corinthians 15:4 to say that God will raise Jesus on the third day. Now we come to with that hope and exhortation, God's offer of forgiveness and Hosea's word of exhortation to return to the one who broke them so that he may heal them, one who struck them so that he may bind them. Believing that there will be a total healing and total renewal of their life again. We come to the next portion, that is 6:4 to 7:3. It talks about the transgression of the covenant. The theme comes again and again and again. Gomer broke the covenant of marriage and ran away. Now Gomer is a representative of the people who had gone after other gods and practices, rejecting their God. Now, the most important observation is that their love was very transient, temporary. Their love for their husband, Gomer's love for her husband, was just a passing love. And Hosea uses a very powerful imagery. Hosea stands here for the people of God, who though entered into a covenant with Yahweh, they could not stand ever in that love relationship. So he likens the love of the people for God as the morning mist. Chapter 6 verses 4 to 5. What shall I do with you, Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? The word Ephraim is very common in the book of Hosea. It actually stands for the northern Israel, the 10 tribes of the northern Israel. Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Now your love is like in the early morning we see mist. We see little dew on the plants. But when the sun rises, this dew will melt. The mist will not be there on the ground. The cloud, morning cloud is the morning mist. It will just disappear. Similarly, your love didn't last till evening. Therefore, verse 5 says, I have hewn them by the prophets. I have sent prophets like Amos to correct them, to cut them to size, maybe the most modern translation probably, to correct them. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as light. So God sent, because their love was not long-lasting love, it was very transient and temporary. It was like morning mist which lasted only for a few hours but melted in the sun. But God kept sending prophets, kept sending His word to judge them and warn them. Now, what does God want? In the next verse, God says, this is what I want. Instead of this transient love which can't last for more than a few hours, I desire, verse 6 says, steadfast love and not sacrifice. The knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. You might have heard this verse echo in various other parts of the Bible. It is this message echoes in Isaiah. This message echoes in Amos. This message is already was there in the words of Samuel. His condemnation against Saul. In various forms, the same theme comes again and again. What does God prioritize? Not worship, false worship, not false spirituality, not the abundance of sacrifice and spiritual activity, but He wants love that will last. The steadfast love, the love that will be for longer period. And that love is the basis of the covenant with God, the relationship. But Gomer could not love Hosea for more than a few days, more than a few weeks or months. The people of Israel could not love their God Yahweh for more than a few years. They went after other gods once they got into Canaan. They practiced Canaanite religions even before entering. They had fallen prey to the Moabite practices. Even when they started their journey at the Mount of Horeb, the foot of the Mount of Horeb, they had already gone after golden calf. Their love was very, very temporary. But God wants steadfast love. This reminds me of Jesus' encounter with Peter after resurrection. When Peter left the group, when he took the group and went back to the old business of catching fish. Failed day, a wasted night of fishing. Then in the morning God comes, gives them fish which is not caught in their net, but He provides them. Then He asks Peter repeatedly, do you love me more than this? Do you love me more than this? Do you love me more than this? He demanded a steadfast love. And Peter on that morning committed himself to love Him forever. And he did it till he was killed, crucified by Nero. That is the love that God expects. So we hear through the book of Hosea, the words of Hosea, the prophet Hosea, the heart of God, hungry for our adoration and our love. I think I should wind up with the last one prophecy today, because there is 7 more chapters to go. We cannot do everything today. Now finally, for this study today, for this week's study, I'll take up the last portion, that is another oracle is found in chapter 7 verse 4 to 16. These are four similes of unfaithfulness of God, people. Four similes of unfaithfulness. The first one is that of an oven, a hearth, you can say if you want to. An oven, a oven which is cool and this thing, then once the batter is prepared, the baker heats it up, and there is terrific heat inside that oven, and he says you are under such a unbearable heat, referring to the political turmoils. Verse 7, that is the last verse of this section, says, all of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. They devour their rulers. Anyone who is thrown into that oven, this hearth, in the baker's place, they are devoured. The rulers are devoured because of the turmoil, political turmoil that goes on. All their kings are fallen, and none of them calls upon me. Godless rulers who are consumed in the political unrest. This is a fact of history. According to 2 Kings chapter 15 to 17, the last 6 kings of northern Israel were assassinated by their rebels, the opposition. The last 6 kings of Israel were killed, assassinated in coup, in conspiracies, plots, and whatever way reasons are. You read 2 Kings 15 to 17. So Israel in their sin has become like a hot baker's oven, the heat of which is consuming their leaders. Some of them ruled only not even for completed their 1 year anniversary. And the second simile that we find here is likening the people to a half-baked cake. 7, 8 to 10. Ephraim mixes himself with the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers devour his strength, and he knows it not. Grey hairs are sprinkled upon them, and he knows it not. Now, this baked cake has two different aspects. One, Ephraim is intermixing with the foreign nations. This refers to intermarriages and unholy alliances for trade and commerce, or even in agriculture. And because of this, their religion, their passion is diluted. And because of that, the Israel now is like a half-baked cake. A cake that is not turned, only one side of the cake, or you can think of probably it is a pancake is imagined here. So a pancake which is not turned. So only one side is baked, the other side is not. But it is absolutely useless. It cannot be eaten. So this is what happened to syncretism, intermingling with other people, and syncretism in the religious arena that has made Israel useless for God. And to add to that, Hosea goes on to use another simile, and that is the simile of a silly dove. Chapter 7 verses 11 to 12. Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, a senseless dove. calling to Egypt, going to Assyria. Egypt is southern kingdom superpower. Assyria is the northern superpower. And as they go, I will spread over them the net. I will bring them down like birds of the heavens. I will discipline them according to the report made to their congregation. So this is the dilly-dallying of the or the political policy of northern Israel. The Assyria is becoming a strong power in the north, and they sometimes think that they will ally with Egypt and seek help. Then they think that Egypt may not be helpful, so they try to appease Assyria. So like a silly, senseless animal or a bird, it's swaying between these superpowers, and they cannot. This comes very powerfully in the book of Isaiah. We will see that when we come to the book of Isaiah. Going after political powers, it's rejecting God. And he says, okay, I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to catch this dove and I'm going to train her. Again, here we can see judgment and love, judgment and hope intermixed. So the people have lost their sense. It is not innocence. They haven't lost. It is not losing their innocence. It's losing common sense. Sometimes this is what happens when people backslide, go away from God. They don't know whom to trust. They don't know whom to believe. They try this God, they try this God, they try that church, they try this church, they go to this place and they go to that place, but they don't go to God. They don't return to God. But God has a way that He will catch them, train them. And that's it. That is what the people of God now is. And the third simile, which we see in the final section or four verses, chapter 7 verses 13 to 16, is this. That is, Israel is like a treacherous bow. What's a treacherous bow? A bow which is crooked. So you are trying to charge the bow and you are trying to hit an arrow, send the arrow, shoot an arrow, but because the bow is not straight, the arrow may not shoot, go to the aim, the place where you have aimed, but it may go up instead of going straight. Sometimes it may boomerang too. It's very dangerous. It actually talks about or is a picture of the futility of human effort without God. When we have all our efforts, even it could be worship, it could be service or any other thing. When there is no God in the life of a person, that life is like a treacherous bow. It cannot aim, it can aim at things, but it will never hit its target, the bullseye. And it may dangerously boomerang and hit that person. So something that goes up may come down and hit that person or his own people. So that's the state of people who are unfaithful to God, who has ignored or who has rejected the covenant with God, the husband and the wife. An oven, heated, turmoil, a useless cake which is not turned because it is intermixed with all sort of ingredients, and a silly dove who has no discernment, and a bow which is very dangerous. Again here we conclude the study today and noting the God's heart. God wants His people. Why? Hoping that they will return. God keeps on demanding love and giving love. He is willing to give His love to His people. And He also demands their steadfast love. So the book of Hosea The study of the book of Hosea continues to give us or exposes the heart of love of God, who yearns for his people to return to him. That's what we are supposed to do. Stay in his love. Honor the covenant that we have made with him. When we said, "You are my God, and I am your son and your daughter," and we entered into that covenant with him, and we need to love him steadfastly and stay in that relationship until our last breath. I hope today's study was an encouragement, and also it was a warning that when we mix true spirituality with some things which may serve some purpose, some convenience, when we try to tweak our faith in order to suit our needs, we are actually making the heart of God grieve very deeply. May God give us the grace to love him, to adore him, and continue to stay with him, and say that we will not depart from him. God bless you. Thanks for being here today. Amen.